This is the story of a man named George, an old man with worn hands, a folding table, and buckets of roses he sold for $5 each on a busy street corner in Chicago. And a man named Richard, rich, loud, and absolutely certain that people like George existed purely for his entertainment. Richard was wrong. By the end of this story, you are going to feel something you didn't expect to feel today. So stay with me. Every single second of this is worth it. George Hadley was 71 years old, and he had been selling roses on the corner of Michigan Avenue and East Wacker Drive for 6 years. He was there every morning by 7. Rain, snow, wind, didn't matter. He'd set up his folding table, arrange his buckets of fresh roses, put on his worn brown jacket with the collar turned up against the Chicago wind, and stand there with the quiet patience of a man who had made peace with his life exactly as it was. He wasn't a loud seller. He didn't shout at people passing by. He didn't wave his flowers or try to pull anyone in. He just stood there, calm and still, like a tree that had decided this particular patch of sidewalk was where it belonged. If someone stopped, he'd smile. If someone bought, he'd wrap the roses carefully in brown paper and wish them a good day. If someone walked past without looking, he didn't take it personally. The regulars liked him. The coffee shop owner 2 doors down always saved him a cup in the morning. The young woman who ran the flower shop a block away, his competitor, technically, always waved at him on her way in. The parking attendant across the street called him Mr. G and looked out for him when the weather got bad. But nobody knew his story. George never talked about himself. If someone asked how long he'd been doing this, he'd say a while and smile. If someone asked where he was from, he'd say around and change the subject. He was friendly but private in the way that some older people are, like a book that welcomes you in but keeps certain chapters closed. He lived alone in a small one-bedroom apartment 12 blocks away. He cooked simple meals. He read at night. He called his daughter every Sunday. She lived in Seattle with her husband and 2 kids, and those Sunday calls were the best part of his week. He slept well. He didn't complain about anything. From the outside, George looked like a man life had quietly passed by, a man who had ended up selling roses on a street corner because nothing bigger had worked out. That was what most people assumed when they looked at him, if they looked at all. Richard Calloway did not look at people like George. He looked past them. Richard was 53 years old, the founder of a real estate development company worth just over $400 million. He was the kind of rich that had stopped being impressed by regular things a long time ago. He had a penthouse 3 blocks from that street corner, a driver, 2 assistants, and the absolute unshakable belief that his success was entirely the result of his own brilliance and that anyone not at his level simply hadn't tried hard enough. He wasn't cruel in a dramatic way. He was cruel in the casual, everyday way that some wealthy people are. The way you are when you've spent so long at the top that the people below you have stopped seeming fully real. On a Thursday afternoon in late September, Richard was walking back from a lunch meeting with 2 of his business associates. Men just like him. Expensive suits, loud laughs. The kind of people who talk about money the way regular people talk about weather. They passed George's corner. Richard slowed down. He looked at the roses, then at George, then at his friends with a smirk already forming. "Watch this," he said. He walked up to George's table. George looked up and smiled the way he smiled at everyone. "Good afternoon," George said. "Can I help you?" Richard looked him up and down slowly. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. He took out a single bill and dropped it on the table without looking at it. It was a $1 bill. "I'll give you this," Richard said loudly, making sure his friends could hear, "if you can name the capital of France." George looked at the dollar, then at Richard. His expression didn't change. "Paris," he said simply. Richard laughed. His friends laughed. "Lucky guess," Richard said, picking the dollar back up and putting it in his pocket. Just to be clear, he took it back. George said nothing. Richard leaned on the table slightly, the way someone does when they want to make themselves feel bigger by making you feel smaller. "Tell you what," he said, "I'll give you $100,000. He let that number sit in the air for a second. His friends went slightly quiet. Even they weren't sure where this was going. $100,000, cash, if you can sell me these roses. In Arabic. Right now." He straightened up and crossed his arms. The smirk was wide. This was the joke. This was the part where the old flower seller stuttered and went red, and Richard and his friends laughed and walked away feeling like they'd had a fun afternoon. That's how it was supposed to go. George looked at Richard for a long moment. Not with anger, not with embarrassment, with the calm, unhurried look of a man who has absolutely nothing to prove and absolutely nothing to fear. Then he straightened up, cleared his throat gently, and he began to speak. What came out of George Hadley's mouth was not broken, nervous Arabic. It was not a few memorized words pulled from somewhere. It was fluid, natural, completely confident Arabic, the kind that doesn't come from a class or an app, but from a life lived inside the language. He spoke for nearly a minute. His hands moved slightly as he talked, the way people do when a language lives in their body. He described the roses, their freshness, the way they had been cut that morning, the particular shade of red that meant they were at their peak. He made a case for why these flowers were worth every dollar. His voice was warm and easy and completely at home in every syllable. Then he stopped, folded his hands in front of him, and looked at Richard. The street corner was completely silent. Richard's smirk was gone. His two friends had stopped moving. A few people nearby who had overheard had slowed to a stop without even realizing it. Richard stared at George. His mouth opened slightly, closed again. How? He started, then stopped. George waited. How do you speak Arabic like that? Richard finally said. His voice had lost its performance. It was a real question now. George was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because I spent 22 years speaking it every day. And the story came out. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just quietly, the way true things tend to come out. George Hadley had spent his career not selling roses on a street corner, but working as a senior diplomat for the United States State Department. He had been posted across the Middle East for over 2 decades: Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, the UAE. He spoke 4 languages fluently: Arabic, French, Farsi, and English. He had sat in rooms where decisions were made that affected hundreds of thousands of people. He had negotiated. He had translated. He had represented his country in moments of genuine tension and genuine hope. He had also watched things he couldn't fix. He had been in places where the situation on the ground was so far removed from what was being decided in comfortable rooms back home that it hollowed something out in him over the years. He'd seen colleagues burned out, families broken by constant relocation, marriages ended by the weight of the work. His own marriage had survived, barely, and only because his wife, Margaret, was the kind of strong that most people don't even know exists. But Margaret had passed away 3 years after he retired. Cancer. Quick and devastating. After she died, George didn't know what to do with himself. The apartment was too quiet. The career was over. His daughter was in Seattle building her own life. He had money, a good pension, savings, no financial worries. He didn't sell roses because he needed the income. He sold roses because he needed the corner. He needed somewhere to be every morning. He needed the cold air and the moving people and the small transactions of kindness. Someone buying flowers for their wife. Someone grabbing a bunch for a first date. Someone getting roses just because their friend was having a hard week. He needed to feel connected to the ordinary flow of life. After decades of living in the extraordinary, the corner kept him human. Richard stood on that sidewalk and listened to all of this. His arms had uncrossed somewhere during George's story. His friends had gone completely quiet behind him. The loud, certain, money-first posture had come down like a curtain dropping. When George finished, Richard didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, I had no idea. Of course you didn't, George said. Not unkindly, just honestly. You didn't ask. That sentence landed harder than anything else. 3 words. You didn't ask. Not an accusation exactly. More like a fact being handed over gently. The kind of fact that stays with you. Richard reached into his jacket again. This time he didn't take out a dollar bill for a joke. He took out his business card and held it out to George. George looked at it, then took it. I'd like to buy every rose you have today, Richard said quietly. Whatever your price. George nodded. He wrapped every bunch carefully in brown paper, the way he always did. 47 roses in total. Richard paid without negotiating. He didn't try to get a deal. He paid what George asked, and then a little more. As Richard picked up the wrapped flowers, he paused. What did you say to me? In Arabic. What exactly did you say? George smiled. Just slightly. I told you the roses were cut this morning. That the red ones are the finest of the season. That flowers given with sincerity. mean more than anything money can purchase. He paused. And I told you that the man selling them has stood in rooms most men never enter and chosen, in the end, to stand here instead. Because here is where life actually is. Richard looked at him for a long moment. Then he did something his two friends had probably never seen him do in a professional setting. His eyes got wet. Not full tears, just that thing that happens when something true gets through the armor you've spent years building. He nodded once, picked up his flowers, and walked away. He came back the next Thursday. Alone this time, no friends, no audience. He bought a single bunch of roses and stood at the corner for 20 minutes, just talking to George about the Middle East, about diplomacy, about what it's like to be in rooms where the stakes are real, about Margaret, about what retirement actually feels like when the thing that defined you is gone. He came back the Thursday after that too, and the one after that. They became, in the strange, quiet way that unlikely things sometimes happen, friends. Two men with almost nothing in common on the surface, and it turned out, more underneath than either expected. George never stopped selling roses. He didn't need Richard's money, and he didn't need to be saved. He just needed to be seen. And Richard, for all his money and all his noise, just needed to learn how to look. On a Sunday morning the following spring, George's daughter came to visit from Seattle. She brought her two kids. They all went to the corner together, Grandpa's corner. The kids called it, and stood there in the early light while George set up his table and arranged his roses and got ready for the day. His granddaughter, who was 6 and had her grandmother Margaret's eyes, picked up a single red rose and held it up to the light. "Grandpa," she said, "why do you sell flowers?" George looked at her. This little girl with her grandmother's eyes standing on his corner in the Chicago morning. "Because," he said, "every person who walks past here is carrying something heavy. And sometimes a flower is the only thing that reminds them the world is still beautiful." She thought about that very seriously, the way 6-year-olds do. Then she nodded like it made complete sense. It did. George Hadley had sat in the most powerful rooms in the world. He had spoken 4 languages. He had served his country for over 2 decades in places most people will never go. And he had chosen, at the end of all of it, to stand on a street corner and hand beauty to strangers one rose at a time. That's not a small life. That is a life so full it couldn't be contained in any office or title or building. And it took one arrogant man's cruel joke to let the rest of the world see it. Never assume you know someone's story from the corner they're standing on. The most extraordinary people are often the quietest ones in the room, or on the street, or behind a folding table with buckets of roses, and a brown jacket and a smile that has seen more of this world than you'll ever know.